introduce our keynote speaker for this evening, Dr. Santhosh Mathew. Following a career in the Indian Administrative Service, where Dr. Mathew served as Additional Chief Secretary for the Government of Bihar and as Chair of the National Council for Teacher Education, he currently holds the country lead position for social and public finance policy at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in India. Dr. Mathew has served as the Joint Secretary at the Ministry of Rural Development within the Indian government, and he was previously Professor of Social Management at India's Civil Service College in Mussoorie and Country Director of the Leadership of Environment and Development Program in India. Welcome, sir. He is going to be in conversation with Mr. Chetan Kapoor. Over the last 20 years, Mr. Chetan Kapoor has traversed the length and breadth of development sector. At present, Chetan serves as the Chief Operating Officer at Tech Mahindra Foundation, having conceptualized its flagship skill development program, SMART. He has also been a mentor at Edumentum since 2018. In the past, Chetan founded organizations to address early childhood education and skill development. He was formerly the Director of Programs at Pratham. So without any further ado, I would now like to invite Dr. Santhosh Mathew and Mr. Chetan Kapoor for a fireside chat.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Leslie. It's a pleasure, absolute pleasure to be here with the Edumentum group. Always something that I really look forward to. And eSpire has certainly become an event that I think all of us in the education space eagerly look forward to. Can't feel more privileged than this today to be talking to someone who I hugely admire. I've known Dr. Santhosh Mathew for a very long time. I first met him when I was myself a complete greenhorn in the social sector. And at that time, he was the State Project Director for Education in Bihar. And I remember how vigorously he had tried to bring out reform in the quality of education in the state of Bihar. So welcome, Dr. Mathew. It's an absolute pleasure to be talking to you today. So let's start with the basics, Santhoshji. I mean, we all claim to be working towards the goal of quality education. However, there is no commonly accepted definition of this phrase. You know, we all sort of sometimes tend to interpret it in different ways. So how would you, after working with possibly all the stakeholders that there are to work with, define the whole idea of quality education?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And congratulations to Edumentum and the Shubulal Family Foundation for all the great work that they're doing. It's really a privilege for me to be here. I would approach the idea of quality education in terms of what it's able to produce. And these are, according to me, people, human beings, first and foremost, who are able to deal with success and failure with equanimity. People who can make productive citizens, willing to lead and able to lead lives that are productive in terms of their economic situation, in terms of their social situation of them and their society, and be able to do that in a sustainable fashion. So these are the only things that I would privilege and what I would urge a good education system to produce, because everything else is a means to an end. And some of those means to an end would be, for example, your ability for critical thinking, your ability to digest vast amounts of information, to be able to get to the roots of it. But that's all for me incidentally. It's ultimately the things that I mentioned in the beginning. And once you have that straight, the rest will fall in place.
Wonderful. I mean, I completely agree with the idea that we have to, at the, to begin with the end in mind, as they say. So it's very important to sort of define where are we heading towards this. So in that context, because you've worked with all the stakeholders, you're working with a funding agency, you've earlier worked with the government, you've known the entire NGO ecosystem quite closely. So within all of this, how do you think we should sort of prioritize the funding and implementation of quality education so that organizations such as Edmentum and all the partners who are mostly startups, youngsters who are very eager to sort of make a contribution in the field of education, what would be your advice and suggestion for these youngsters?
Yeah, so this is going to be a long one, and you must pardon me for that. So I want to build on a few basic concepts, and which are basically, none of this are mine. It's stuff that I picked up from wise people whom I've had the good fortune to encounter in my professional and personal lives. So I would use the word funding as well. So I look at financing as being of four types. And this is from a government point of view. I'll start there. And then I will go on to the role of Samaj, of Sarkar, and of Bazaar, which I think are very interesting ways to look at how these three elements need to come together. Now, when you want Sarkar to do what you expect Sarkar to do, and things that only Sarkar can do, then it has been my observation from my vantage point of years in government that there are four kinds of monies that government deals with. One is its own tax rupee that it's able to collect as government revenue. Okay, it has got, so one of the features of that, it's large, it's plentiful. Of course, not as plentiful as we require it for the jobs of we require our country to be doing, but it's enormous. But it comes with a lot of restrictions, and these are in the nature of the democratic beast in terms of accountabilities and all of that. On top of that sits what I call the multilateral rupee, which you get from multilateral organizations, which your country is a member, like the World Bank, the United Nations, WHO, all of this. And above that sits the bilateral rupee. Again, between these two, there are some interchangeability. And finally, you get the philanthropic rupee. Now, if you really want to construct a good sarkar, organization and delivery, you actually need an ideal combination of all these four kinds of rupees, where the tax rupee is able to handle volumes and the programmatic stuff, and all others then depending on what you have access to. And particularly here I will call out the role of the philanthropic rupee, and that's where the role of Samaj comes in. Let's talk of education, right? Now, according to me, if you really want education to play the role it has the potential to, then you will have to recognize that the talent infrastructure among providers of education, meaning your teachers and your institutions, etc., but largely teachers, and your students and the guardians of students, what you have is a normal curve of talent, right? Where bulk of the people are in the middle, and you have some extraordinary brilliant folks on the right side of the distribution, and you will always find on the left side of the distribution laggards or whatever you call it. Now, unless you set up your education space by combining Samaj, Sarkar, and Bazaar in such a way that you construct an edifice which speaks to this normality in the distribution of talent, where you make it possible for ordinary people to do extraordinary things, right? For ordinary teachers, for ordinary students, for ordinary guardians to be able to produce extraordinary results, our education system will fail. And you need the coming together of Samaj, Bazaar, and Sarkar to be able to engender this, to be able to engineer this, to be able to put this in place. This for me is really the route of, or the pathway through which, or the framework through which we should be looking at education.
Quite fascinating, Dr. Mathew. I mean, I've heard this from others earlier, but coming from you, there's just so much of gravitas that gets added to this. Um, so now, in what you've just said, while you've alluded to the fact that that the key stakeholders and especially the teachers kind of fall in that curve that you just were talking about. Let's also look at the role of technology, which is becoming so much more, I would say, interesting in the space. I mean, even though technology has existed for a long time now, but I think what we are seeing in the current times is something which is particularly interesting. And I know you have some very interesting and strong views on it. So let's have them.
Yeah, now you're really setting me up for controversy, but I'll grab it with both hands. See, the COVID scenario that we are going through now, which we encountered, has led us to believe that technology is really of great promise. I agree with that. Technology is of great promise because because what happened really? Children were not able to school. They needed to, their educational life needed to proceed, and therefore there were some really wonderful interventions that came on. I mean, the national teacher, Diksha, for example, stuff that in Tech Mahindra that you have done in Delhi and then taken on to Tripura and now on to Bihar. So many people have come forward to be able to produce good quality content, decouple the child, the teacher, and the classroom so that online learning becomes possible. I think it's a great advancement, but I also think it's a complete red herring. I think it is a complete misunderstanding of the potential of technology. And I fear that it may lull us into a complacency that we can ill afford given the vastness of the problem. Now, here I'm not talking of, availability of devices, penetration of mobile phone networks. I'm not talking of that because I believe that that's a problem that can quite well, without great difficulty be solved. I mean, you have Chhattisgarh, where they are now, before the last election, they distributed devices to lakhs of people. And it's only a matter of time, given the way the cost of devices is going down, the way the cost of data is already so low, and given the way our sort of blind or dark spots for connectivity are quickly disappearing, all those things will get sorted out. Of course, things need to be done, particularly people who are disadvantaged, people who are underprivileged. We need to put in place systems so that the device availability and access to networks problem is solved. But the danger I see is what happened during the COVID. It has led many people in the education sector to believe that, hey, technology has got great promise, and this is the directionality of technology, which is to decouple the student, teacher, and the classroom. I think this is a huge mistake. This is almost like the early days. What early days? Even now, when computers came into government, and computers came into many offices in the private sector, etc. What was it used? It was used like a typewriter. You took out MS Word or some other open source version of a word processor, you type stuff, you took a printout, or you pass it on via email. I mean, there's such a gross underutilization of the computing power of the machine that is sitting in front of you. The same is happening with the leveraging of technology for education. And why do I say that? For me, at the heart of the promise of technology in education is the earlier question that I brought about, is the normality of distribution of talent. How do you make it possible for normal people to do extraordinary things? And how am I conceptualizing this? The power lies in being able to, what Atul Gawande, a medical doctor, professor at the Harvard Medical School from Maharashtra, from India. He's a first generation migrant to the US. The way he conceptualized problems as being simple, complicated, and complex. Let me give you the example from the airline industry. For decades, we thought flying an airplane was a complex problem. And I mean, there is this thing that JRD Tata, when he used to board a flight, he used to ask what is the name of the pilot, right? He was the first he ran the first Indian airline. So who was the pilot? Because from there, he then decoded the safety of his flight and the comfort of his flight, because the skill of the pilot, which actually, similarly, in driving a car, we also wanted a good driver, because, it's like, I mean, in government, I worked with many chief ministers. In my tenure as secretary in rural development, I was always asked by ministers and MLAs, and I want a very good block development officer for this block. And I used to wonder, I mean, everybody wants only very good people, but the talent distribution is normal. So everybody wants everybody only on the right side of the distribution. So are we setting ourselves up for failure by just forgetting all the design elements of our work and just implying that we just want that great person who will solve all our problems? That is the question in education that we need to answer, and that is the true promise of technology. And what do I mean by that? Now, there are so many things in the life of a teacher, in the life of an institution which is in charge of delivering education to our children. There are so many things that need to be done, which are simple. Admin tasks for one, reporting for another. Now, if you can implement data standards, if you can implement registries, you can implement single source of truth, then one piece of data entry means the entire cascade of interoperable systems will pick it up and cascade it. So that's one way in which a complicated problem is made simple, right? So that's the interconnectivity. So you're basically reducing the administrative burden of the business of being a teacher. But that's just, again, a very small marginal thing. The second is the very act of teaching. Now, teaching has got many parts, right? Like I said, I am privileging the nurturing of a student who's able to take success and failure with equanimity. I am privileging the nurturing of a student who is able to lead socially, economically, and ecologically productive lives. We have not yet been able to solve for the algorithmization of this, and we may get there, but I don't care. We are talking of the now. But there are so many things in the teaching of calculus, of alphabets, of trigonometry, of Pythagoras theorem. I mean, whatever you call it, personalized adaptive learning today holds out the promise of being able to deliver a teaching learning experience that not only aids the teacher, but is on the boundary of even excelling some teachers. Now, let me give you the example from retinal neuropathy, right? So you take an eye scan, and what a good quality expert is able to, a doctor is able to take from a retinal scan and perceive, we now know that a machine reading of those retinal scans is able to now predict 4 to 5 years in advance of dramatic cardiac events in the life of that person by doing a retinal scan, which the human eye cannot capture. Okay, that's a very extreme example of the power of technology. But here I'm talking of personalized adaptive learning, which is able to, at scale, detect patterns, at scale, be able to harness the brilliance of the people on the right side of a talent distribution, irrespective of where they are. The great thing about India is that although we may be quite ordinary in a number of things, we have some of the best people in the world in almost every sector. I'm using the word almost because in some I don't think we have it, but that's for a different day. So how can we leverage the power of technology to be able to bring that scarce resources of talent and capabilities that lie on the right side of distribution and make it possible for the people in the middle of the distribution to be able to enjoy, to benefit from it? And for me, personalized adaptive learning is at the heart of it. But there's a fundamental problem in personalized adaptive learning. What is it? It is the rent economics 1.0, people who study economics will understand that you have profits that come from rent, i.e. the profits you make because you have access to scarce resources as a monopoly, which others don't have access to. Now, Google is a very good example. Why just Google? Uber, I mean, many of these large sort of, population scale interventions that we see today, they are actually making money out of monopolistic access to the data that they have. Of course, they are leveraging the quality of the services to be able to attract more and more, and then they indulge in acquisitions. Then they will engage in building up the market by predatory pricing. And once they've captured the market and have gained monopolistic positions, then they destroy competition and then start harvesting monopolistic rents. We've seen that in Uber, right? I mean, in the initial days of Uber, drivers were able to quadruple their incomes. It was worthwhile to invest in a car. I know of situations, I've heard that there are many, bank, not managers, but below that, who've actually taken a loan from the bank, quit their jobs, and maybe become Uber drivers because they were earning 60, 70,000 rupees a month, and the choice of working when they wanted. But then when the monopolistic power went into the hands of Uber, then everybody else began to lose, and Uber is slowly beginning to gain. The same with personalized adaptive learning, same with the power of technology. And that is where Samaj, Sarkar, and Bazaar have to play their respective roles. What all the wonderful people who are sitting here today, who have benefited from your program, if they really have to make their contribution, then they need access and they need protection against the monopoly stranglehold that some of the providers in education are slowly gaining because they have access to data which others do not. So that is why we need Sarkar to step in and to ensure that the data is a public good. And data is available through APIs to a developer community. And the real competition should not be based on the monopolistic rent you have, but should be based on the quality of service, the quality of the algorithms that you are able to produce, and data through a consent architecture, through stewardship, and by Samaj, philanthropy, helping government construct that. Because I have been an IT manager in government for over 20 years, and I know that it's simply impossible for government to be able to build the sophisticated systems that will produce the data lakes that will really give a fillip to all the gains that technology has to offer for India, leveraging the fantastic resource of people that you have nurtured through the Edumentum program. So let me stop here. This will be a monologue.
No, I mean, this was utterly fascinating. But just to put it, in simple terms, I think what I heard you say is that, right now the power to harness technology is really in the hands of the bazaar. And that has to move to the Samaj, and the Sarkar has to sort of facilitate this movement. And only then can we say that we'll really be able to find the kind of solutions that technology can truly provide. So I would say
no. Chetan, let me modify that a little bit.
Yeah,
please.
sure. Yeah.
You'll kindly allow me. So I'm saying that, but not exactly that. What I'm saying is that Bazaar is the best for allocative efficiency. Bazaar is the best to be able to trigger innovation. There's no doubt about that. It enforces the discipline of the market, of supply and demand, talking to each other to produce both supplies of a quantity of products and services and the price at which the market will clear. But for a proper bazaar to work, there are certain basic conditions that have to be fulfilled. A bazaar which is effective cannot work if it is based on monopoly access to the most precious thing, which is the data, the scholastic response of millions of our children. That has to be made available so that the bazaar can operate in the way it's meant to operate. Now, if the bazaar has to operate like a good bazaar, fulfilling the conditions for a good marketplace, as we know our scholarship in economics tells you, then you need the sarkar to do certain things, and the sarkar is compromised because of its ability, and therefore you need samaj, philanthropy, to work hand in hand with sarkar to be able to generate those enabling conditions, which are again technology driven, so that the bazaar can work very well. That's the formulation that I would urge you to and our listeners today to think about.
Sure. So I guess, our time is, we already passed the time which was allotted to us, but since this has been such a fascinating conversation, I'm sure the audience has questions. We already have more than 60 participants here and perhaps more on the YouTube channel where this is being telecast. So let's just invite the audience to get a few questions for Dr. Mathew. I don't see any on the chat box yet, but if you have, please share. Okay, I think we have a question. So we have a question from Shalini, who I think is from Mantra for Change. And she says that Bihar recently topped the Diksha dashboard in terms of creating solutions, but there is a huge number of stakeholders, teachers and children, not having access to technology. So how do you see this bridge to be gapped, the bridge between the creator and the user?
Yeah, so government has to play a role there, but the problem is that, so one is government has a role to play, and for government to be able to play its role, I used to work in the finance department of Bihar government for a short while, and I was party to a lot of conversations where every department comes to the finance department asking for more money. Health and education are two of the prime suspects in that. And the conversation actually used to go as follows. I want 5,000 crores because I want to hire more teachers. I want to buy more, construct more buildings, more textbooks, and health will come and say the same thing about doctors, nurses, supplies. But what really happens is that in a democratic context, you exercise your voting power to be able to reward people whom you think have done a great job when you elected them to power, right? That's the sort of primordial driving force inside your electoral market, in the same way that the profits are the primordial sort of engine in your economic markets. And there, the question really that is faced with the political leadership of a state or of a country or whatever it is, they have to maximize on their credibility with the electorate. That's the way a democracy is meant to function.
Sure.
And here the problem here is none of the solutions that most education departments and health departments bring to the political class today, especially in health and education, are worthy of support. Why? Because support, not that, it will not lead to some incremental changes, etc. I mean, let me talk about, teachers, or let me talk about doctors. The question is, okay, you want to hire 5,000 doctors? No problem. How are you going to solve the problem of 10,000 doctors whom you already have, 80% of whom are spending 70% of the time not inside a government facility, but just outside the facility running the government clinic? What is your solution to that? I'm not saying that there is no solution. There is a solution. If Samaj, Bazaar and Sarkar get together, in fact, Shibu Lal currently is engaged in one such endeavor where he is freely giving of his time. In fact, I keep telling Shibu Lal that his most precious resource is not his wealth, it is actually the thinking and the competencies that he brings. And I've been seeing the full display of that over the last month and a half, is to work with government to design such systems so that there is the transparency, the observability, so that those government systems begin to function well. And it is my challenge to you, or it is my conclusion, that if we can build the capacity of the state to be able to deliver to these very basic things in education and health, then your political leadership will not be found wanting.
Right.
It will not be found wanting. But for that, this is what you and me have to do. We have to help build those systems by getting Samaj and the Bazaar to work in such a way that these decisions can be made, that chief ministers can say, I will take money out of this and I'll put it in education. I'll take money out of this and put it in devices. I'll take money out of this and put it in connectivity. Why? Because there is that you will reward that person in the electoral hustings.
Right. Quite profound. So we have to close, but before we close, there's one question that I must ask you, and this is on behalf of all the social entrepreneurs who are listening, because that's what Edumentum is. It's got a great set of people who recently stepped into the space, each of them wanting to bring about a change. So how can these social entrepreneurs really set off that virtuous and generative cycle of change between the various actors in the education ecosystem? How do they sort of take the first few steps in the direction, especially when we are living in such tumultuous times where funding, for example, is not easy to get? So that's the question that we'll sort of keep as the last one.
Okay, I have to ensure I don't speak too long on this because I have lots to say about this. I apologize. See, funding is the least of the problems. What we need is a good dose of collective action. Because the kind of things that I've been explaining to you, and I know the resistance that politicians have toward, not resistance, really why they think it's too big to solve. They believe that they don't have the right partnerships who will work with them to solve for. Now, let me tell you, what you need is social entrepreneurs getting into a good dose of collective action, being able to say not what they can do. Of course, what they can do is extremely important, but what they can do and how they can string together a number of these things so that they can demonstrate the feasibility of the coming together of each of the small, big and medium things you're going to do. Fire the imagination of our political class and our philanthropic class. Because even collective action is not going to solve for everything, because some really major policy support and substantial funding will be required for the social entrepreneurs to thrive, which is, I said, no, Bazaar Samaj wala jo equation hai. So to indulge in collective action rather than individual action, and stop lamenting, but come together to work in partnership to demonstrate, at least from a conceptual point of view, trigger the imagination that this is actually possible, so that philanthropy and government can come together and open up those spaces so that the monopoly rent-seeking behavior of large capital that we are soon going to see, if you're not already seeing, particularly in health and education, that is stymied and a level playing field is set up so that true contribution, true innovation, and a proper market can actually function.
Absolutely. So thank you so much, Santhosh. I mean, this has been absolutely riveting. I wish we had more time because, the appetite was just getting whetted. But unfortunately, I mean, if we sort of don't stop here, I think the Edumentum folks will probably never ever invite me again for this. So we'll stop here, and thank you so much once again for joining this fireside chat. I really hope to have a real fireside chat with you one day. So thank you so much, and thanks to the Edumentum team. Back to you, Leslie. Thank you so much.